Welcome to Vitality Made Simple. This is the podcast that equips you to feel better, look better, and to enjoy better relationships. Life is all about relationships, and feeling physically strong, mentally robust improves your relationships. It is a pleasure to have Dr. Alessio Fasano with us today. Welcome, Dr. Fasano.
Thank you, Debbie, for having me on your podcast.
Oh, it is a joy. Dr. Fasano is a world-renowned expert in celiac disease and autoimmunity in the gut microbiome. He is a professor at Harvard in the medical school as well as in the School of Nutrition. In the year 2000, he and his team actually discovered zonulin. Zonulin is a biomarker of intestinal permeability. You all hear it talked about as leaky gut. Now, Dr. Fasano, give our listeners some background into he's a pediatric gastroenterologist. I don't think I even mentioned that. Who was raised in Naples, Italy, and came to the United States. I'm like, wow, that's pretty incredible to leave Naples. But how did you get interested in this, and how did celiac disease propel you to discover zonulin?
So, again, there are two ways to answer your question. The sanitary way is I would tell you I was smart enough to think about all this, and because I'm an illuminated mind. And then the story that I believe will be a little bit more entertaining and I believe more interesting, that is much less glamorous. So as you just mentioned, I was born and raised in the region in the south of Italy near Naples, where I did all my medical school and so on and so forth. And I knew that I wanted to do pediatrics from the very, very beginning. And the school where I went, it really had from the beginning the idea that I want to do research. So I went to the department of pediatrics, and the 90% of the research in the department of pediatrics was on celiac disease. And I said, thank you, but no thank you. And I really want to do something that will be impactful. I want to do something on cancer. HIV was starting at that time. And this fellow that just came back from the University of Chicago, where he was there for a sabbatical, said, you really want to do something impactful in pediatrics? Diarrheal diseases. And I said, excuse me, diarrheal disease is so no glamorous. I mean, what a big deal. And he instructed me and educated me and said, by the end of this year, 5 million kids would die of diarrheal diseases. There will be a fraction of who would die of cancer and so on and so forth. So I joined the department, as a young medical student, and I started to do research on diarrheal diseases. But on my clinical training, I was, exposed to celiac disease a day in, a day out, because that's what they were doing. And then, during my training, at a certain point, I said, okay, I learned a lot about the physiology of the gut, but I don't know anything about the bugs that eventually give diarrheal diseases. And I need to learn the flip of the coin if I want to do this right. And the gentleman told me, okay, if you want to do that, you got to go to the United States. You got to go to Baltimore, a place that is called the Center for Vaccine Development. They do a lot of stuff on bugs that give diarrheal diseases there. And you will learn, whatever you need to learn. I was supposed to be there 2 months. I ended up to be there for 2 years. And during these 2 years, I was put in charge to develop a vaccine against cholera that, among all the bugs, is the ones that are much impactful in terms of morbidity and mortality. Of course, third world countries still is, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, I was given the task. This was the beginning when, genetic engineering was at the dawn of the beginning of the story. So I had to genetic engineer this bug. I spent 1.5 years in doing that. And finally, I got this unbelievable product. I said, this is good. It works beautiful. In animals, it doesn't give you, the diarrhea that they have before. They are immunoprotected and so on and so forth. Long story short, they decided to go a clinical trial. Of course, now you have to find volunteers to do that. And at that time, volunteers were medical students. So they, for a relatively small amount of money, they got, to eventually sign up to got 3 possibilities. Placebo, so you drink water and you're going to be fine. You cost your money for nothing. my vaccine that I reassured them that was going to work. And then, the real deal. But we said, if you got the real deal, we will take care of you. And it didn't work. So, I mean, the people that they got the real deal got, 4 gallons, 5 gallons of diarrhea, huge amount of diarrhea. And the one that they got the vaccine was down to 1 or 2, but still not good enough. So, bottom line, a year and a half of science really, literally flushed in the toilet. No point intended.
Yeah, yeah.
So
We
I
love
got home
puns
for a
here.
couple of days. I didn't show up in the lab, and then I started to go to the draw board and said, "What's going on?" And eventually, I discovered another toxin that was making the intestine leak. And you started the mechanism of how this toxin was working, and I realized, my gosh, this toxin works on machinery that we have. It's so complex, it's strange that we have there just to be the target of a toxin and make us sick. And I reasoned Colorado must be smart enough to study gut physiology and develop an analog or something that we use to do this for living. And that's how we discovered zonulin, this molecule that makes the intestine more permeable. And then from there, the rest is history. There is a wealth now of data from a publication, more than 1,000 papers on zonulin that, affects, many chronic inflammatory diseases. But anyhow, I finished that, went back to Italy, start again, finished my career. I became, faculty there, and then they called me for good here in the United States in 1993. So you were not born yet. And then, jump on a flight, move over here, and, start to see patients. And one day, 1 month, one year passed by, and I didn't see a single celiac patient. And I wrote the paper at that point, said, where are all the American celiac gone? And I reasoned, if the 2 elements that are necessary to develop celiac disease are genes that you're born with and grains that contain gluten, they are both here. Because, we in the United States are from European ancestor mostly. We ate the grains like they eat in Europe, and yet in Europe, this was in rampage. Here, nothing. And then we launched this huge, screening nationwide, involving more than 14,000 people, and that planted the flag celiac disease on the ground. That's the nutshell, the non-glamorous story of how I got in celiac disease and the leaky gut situation.
Well, health starts in the gut, and I guess careers start in the gut too. Who would know that diarrhea would start all of your incredible success? I loved your book. I read Gluten Freedom when I heard you speak probably 8 years ago initially, and your analogies are excellent, Dr. Fasano. Share with and your humor. I know you have a sense of humor, I can tell. So share with our listeners your analogy about the walled city that makes me think of Italy and how that relates to leaky gut or intestinal permeability.
Sure. So, while all this was happening, the paradigm to develop any disease of humankind was based on 2 pillars: who you are, genetically speaking, and your lifestyle, meaning your environment. These are the 2 elements that we thought that were necessary, sufficient. And then, there were some, epidemiological observations that put this paradigm, under scrutiny. For example, if you embrace a Western lifestyle, you see an increase of chronic inflammatory diseases over time that's so steep in a relatively short period of time, and a specific time of human evolution. Just to put in perspective for who's listening, the humankind, for the 2 million years that we evolved, have been sick and died mostly by infectious diseases. That was the main reason why we got sick and tired and died. And this was until the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, when we start to realize what are the intimate mechanisms that make us susceptible to microorganisms. So we understood infectious diseases. We started to develop tools like the antibiotics, vaccines, sanitation water, that kind of stuff to try to prevent the impact. And this was implemented mostly in the Western Hemisphere. All right. Developing countries didn't have the means to do that. And what we saw in the Western Hemisphere, that it's diseases like rheumatic fever, TB, polio, measles, they just started plummeting incredibly. While during the same period, we had this rise increase of chronic non-transmissible inflammatory diseases such as food allergies, cancer, metabolic disorder, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer, autoimmunity and that kind of stuff. So in other words, if you embrace a Western lifestyle, you don't die fast, but of infections, you die slowly of chronic inflammation. And then, we realized, and this is, the other premise of this is that, okay, because the time is so short, we're talking about 30, 40 years to see all this, you can't blame genetics. That takes generation to be the genetic mutation to do all this. Got to be the environment that changed too fast for us to adapt. And that's the pessimistic way to see the story. But if we want to see this in a more optimistic way, the old paradigm, if I'm born with a gene for breast cancer or colon cancer or Alzheimer, it's not destiny that I develop this problem. It depends how I play my genetic cards, i.e. my lifestyle. If I play them well, then I may just stay in a potential situation that would never materialize clinically. If, as we've done by embracing a Western lifestyle, I play my genetic cards in a wrong way, then that genetic predisposition will switch to clinical applicability. And the other thing that we learned from celiac disease was maybe that these two elements are necessary but not sufficient, because as genetic mutation did not happen in the past 40 years, mutation or change of the grains did not happen either. And we know that the grains containing gluten are the environmental factor that triggers celiac disease. So it got to be something else. And what we found were three elements, additional three elements. These two worlds are segregated, divided by barriers. The ones that we know the most is the skin, because we see it. The most sophisticated, complex, and the largest of all is the intestine. So you got to have a barrier that works so that you keep at bay these enemies, so to speak. And going to the analogy of the book, it's like that you have, a medieval, town in which you have the walls around the city to protect you, okay? But you can't be totally isolated for the rest of the world. You need to have some, levee bridges coming down to allow stuff to come in, people to come in, or stuff to go out. And that's how these barriers are regulated. When they are tightly regulated, you open up the space in between cells, these gates, these levee bridges, and allow stuff to come in or get out under tightly controlled conditions. And this is what we call, mucosal energy, i.e. healthy status. Of course, when these bridges, they got open, they get stuck open for too long. Now junk can come in, endotoxin from bacteria, gluten that is not digested, food that is not completely digested. In other words, stuff that now comes on this other side. And because our genetic predisposition, our immune system sees this enemy coming in. And get back to the power of the city. Now you have the soldiers there say, you're not belonging here. You try to invade our town here. And what you do, you fight. And when you fight, there is collateral damage that, is inflammation. Inflammation that sometimes materializes on the battlefield, and therefore you develop conditions like celiac disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, EOE, food allergies, colitis, and that kind of stuff. Or these soldiers, armed soldiers, once exposed to enemies, they can migrate in any place of your body. They can go in the brain and make you to develop Alzheimer. They can go in the pancreas and make you develop diabetes. Can go to the joint and develop rheumatoid arthritis and so on and so forth. But all this starts because that segregation, that wall, is not working anymore. And back to Zonulin, our contribution was, what is the key that, opened these gates? What is the system that opened this, levee? And that's what the Zonulin molecules, they do. They make the intestine leak, they make the blood-brain barrier leak. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if that leaks for too long, you lose the control, who is coming in, who is going out, and you pay consequences.
No, and I really do want to touch upon the brain consequences. So from what I understand, we have this gut dysbiosis. We have chronic inflammation, pathogens, whatever coming that disrupt the gut. That increases zonulin release, this biomarker, this protein that in turn causes the gut to be more leaky, which produces more inflammation. It's a vicious cycle, right, Dr. Fasano? So once you start this loop, um, you're just going to have pro-inflammatory problems on the whole body. This is what got me interested in it, from the oral microbiome's impact on the gut microbiome, because of my practice is isolated to just chronic inflammatory diseases. I see before and after blood tests such as C-reactive protein, or the SED rate, things that really improve once we improve zonulin. So you can get zonulin measured on different stool testing. Um, and for our listeners, Dr. Fasano is the reason we can measure zonulin, and we see these correlations just incredibly. Once I see the zonulin number, I kind of know how to start helping people. So tell us about your celiac disease does affect nutrient absorption. So consequently, it affects brain. That led you to all kinds of research into autoimmunity, MS, Parkinson's disease. Uh, in your first book, the first book that he and Susie Flaherty wrote is Gluten Freedom. The second book is Gut Feelings. I really recommend that you read both of them, because um, Dr. Fasano, the reason I wanted Dr. Fasano is really for his heart and soul, not all his credentials, because it comes across so clearly how compassionate you are, and your humility. You have not been stuck on being uh, the hero. You've really just tried to find truth and to help people. So you told this story in Gluten Freedom about Eleanor, this woman who uh, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. We didn't practice this, folks. He didn't want any questions ahead of time. So I'm really putting you on the spot, Dr. Fasano. But tell us the story of Eleanor.
So, you know, to capitalize on what you just said, and then we talk about Eleanor. The um, the reality of the story is that not only you have to be genetically predisposed and to have an increase of, exposed to antigen from the environment and increased gut permeability. The other two elements that you just touched upon that I want to really, discuss so that give a sense of the chronic inflammation is the immune system. Of course, it becomes hyper-belligerent. So part of the story, a fourth pillar beside these three, is you have to have an immune system that's prone to do inflammation. Mm-hmm. And the fifth one, that probably is the most important of all, is this ecosystem that now we call microbiome. Mm-hmm. That, of course, is everywhere in the body. The one that's most studied is in the GI tract, so the intestinal microbiome. And the role of microbiome plays a tremendously important role because you impinge on the composition and function of the gut microbiome, but also has a strong association to chronic inflammatory diseases that, can be predicted, particularly during the last trimester of pregnancy and so on and so forth, whether it's going to happen to the baby and that kind of stuff. With that premise, and for what we discussed before, one of the most fascinating lessons that we learn from celiac disease is that there is a direct connection between the gut and the brain, what we call technically the gut-brain axis. That the brain communicated with the gut was known for a long, long time. So that's the way that we somatize where we're stressed, for example, with GI symptoms. So I'm very stressed and I have stomachache or I have diarrhea. What was a notion that we didn't know well is that this is bidirectional, communication. So the gut can also communicate with the brain. And it does in several non-mutually exclusive matters. So microbiota, they can impinge on the vagal nerve, and the neural network of the vagal nerve that is the communication with the gut and the brain. It can affect, situation in the brain um, through neuroendocrine signaling. We have a plethora of hormones in the GI tract that can affect, our, behavior, and therefore changes in that sense can create a condition that can, change the signaling and therefore the behavior of the host. The microbiome can produce molecules that can affect our behavior directly, or can mimic mediators that we use to, change our, behavior. Um, to the point in which when we have an imbalance in the microbiome, um, so what we call dysbiosis, and this impinge on brain functions, there are some bacteria that have been identified to do this specifically because you can take them and put in an animal model and see that this animal will change behavior. They are called psychobiotics because they affect our psyche, meaning, if we're anxious, if we're depressed, if we have eating disorders, our level of attentions seems to be all also non-exclusively regulated by, the microbiota. And, the gut microbiota can also create the condition of inflammation, as I told you before, that will spill from the gut and go anywhere.
Yeah.
I purposely left the brain out when we were talking about the first question because that's such a peculiar situation there. One of the most frequent symptoms that people with celiac disease they experience are neurological or behavioral symptoms, short memory loss, mood swings, chronic headache, all the way to seizures, and everything in between, ADHD, you name it. And again, this has fueled a lot of attention on this gut-brain axis in conditions that are outside celiac disease, like neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer. And this the story of Leonore that, again, it's somebody that eventually, developed Alzheimer relatively early. She was a teacher, and her life was destroyed, and all 9 yards, and eventually, she was diagnosed with, Alzheimer, and it turns to be a chronic inflammation in the brain that mimic Alzheimer, was not Alzheimer, was gluten, driven. She came to the clinic because, again, there were some hints that gluten would not agree with her body, but, they pay attention to this. So other people, they actually disregarded the matter because this is voodoo science. It's not science. And again, long story short, this is n equal 1, of course, Debbie. So I don't want to make, the false, impression that, all folks that are diagnosed with Alzheimer would benefit from going gluten-free. But in her case, in that particular case, as she was a teacher, she was, she had a family and she lost everything. It turns to be that the neuroinflammation was not, genetically driven like Alzheimer, but was, the consequence of neuroinflammation instigated by gluten. And once she went on a gluten-free diet, she was able to get her life back. So she was in a retirement, facility, and was assisted 24/7 by people, and she was able to go back to her family.
Yeah, and she went back to work, right? Didn't she go back to
She went
teaching?
back to work.
It's an incredible story. But Dr. Fasano, this is the wonderful news, because if somebody is having any kind of problem, they can just stop gluten, and they don't have to say, I'm never going to have another, hot roll in my life. They can say, I'm going to go for 3 months, 6 months. I mean, that's the hope you've instilled, because um there's nothing, to me, there's not a death sentence worse than the Alzheimer's diagnosis, because it's such living death, and it just the people's relationships get so harmed, they're not themselves anymore. Um, so what you've done is so huge. I would just encourage anyone, and with the stool testing, I use GI map. We can look at Zonulin, of course, that's an add-on that I always do. But we can also look at anti-gluten IgA, and to know how that's treating that individual. So tell us about any fermented foods. I know you're so busy today. I want to hear about some of the strategies that you like to employ to improve gut health that indeed improves neuroimmune health. Uh, we've talked about psychobiotics on the podcast. Dr. Ted Dinan and John Cryan are beloved by me also because of what they've done with the gut microbiome. So, what strategies do you tell people to do to heal this as well as ceasing gluten?
So this is a question that I receive all the time, as you can imagine, because there is growing evidence now with very little skepticism left that gut health impinge on our entire body health. Mainly because, again, it's the largest interface that we have with the environment. And if the gut health is affected, we can have, if we're genetically predisposed, serious consequences. We discussed about the Illinois, one of the example. But so if you go into the literature, since the microbiome is becoming a focus of interest, you will find a plethora of manuscripts and papers and evidence that link the microbiome dysfunction or dysbiosis, whatever you want to call it, with every single disease of humankind, every single one. And of course, this now become prime time interest of people that keep reading and say, oh, geez, I have colon cancer, I have dysbiosis that brought me there. I have, I don't know, Alzheimer, that's dysbiosis. And of course, they come to the clinic and say, I know that my gut is not working well and it is making my life miserable because I develop X, Y, or Z. What can I do to fix it? And again, there are, there is no easy answer there. We start, building the blocks to understand, first of all, what dysbiosis is all about, what that means, because there is no such a thing as the quote unquote normal microbiome. We're all different genetically, and the goal is to have a symbiotic relationship with the microbiome that is in sync with our genome, so that keep us in balance. So you and I, in other words, are very different, genetically speaking, and our microbiome for sure is very different. But we both need to maintain a glucose level at a certain level. We both have to make sure that the kidney will filter in a certain way so that the creatinine level is going to be in a certain range. So all this to say, very different genetically, very different with microbiome, but the product of the two specific metabolic pathways are very common to us as a human being. The goal is to maintain that symbiotic relationship that keep us healthy. And again, the question is, how do I realize that my microbiome is off sync, and what can I do about this? The first question will be answered by a huge amount of data that are coming in the literature and analyzed by artificial intelligence and so on and so forth that will explain us what is a good microbiome. Because if we don't answer that, we cannot go to the second step. Is my microbiome in balance? And if so, what I can do about it? And of course, to make your gut healthy, to make sure the microbiome is in balance, and therefore, because the two are mutually influencing, your zonulin level will go back to normal and so on and so forth. You can use prebiotics, you can use probiotics, you can use symbiotics, postbiotics, and so on and so forth. Or a lifestyle that makes sure that you take care of your microbiome. So good sleep hygiene, good exercise, level of stress that is within the control, and so on and so forth. But the low-hanging fruit, the very low-hanging fruit is diet. These folks, they eat whatever we eat. An imbalanced diet will create for sure an imbalanced microbiome that is not good, no matter who you are. If you allow me a parallel, imagine the microbiome as a farm with several animals. You have pigs, you have horses, you have chicken and rabbit and non-nayats. They eat different things. And Mother Nature, to be a human being, decided that we have to have, I don't know, 100 chickens, 2 cows, 3 pigs. And therefore, you have to eat to feed these folks accordingly. Now, if you don't eat the chicken, feed the chicken because you don't give the food, what's going to happen? That, you're going to not have 100 chicken. They will die because, they don't have food to grow. Out of the metaphor, we were supposed to eat in a certain way, okay? As gutter hunters, we really were supposed to eat a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables, nuts, tubers. Why? Because they're there. You pick meat, absolutely. Once in a while, you have to be a good hunter. And by the way, lean meat, these are animals that escape predators, including human predators. So that's not fat, filled meat. And, again, that's what we're supposed to eat. Fast forward to 2024. Do we eat that way? Absolutely not. First of all, we eat in a total imbalanced way. Particularly in the Western Hemisphere, our lifestyle, for whatever reason, is considered so busy that we don't have time to food procurement anymore, meaning make the shopping and then cooking by ourselves. So we delegate to the third party to do that for us. And they don't care because they care only the bottom line of, of the economic return on investment. That's it. So it's like to say that for 2 million years, we engineer an unbelievable car, a Ferrari, that was supposed to have, super octane, gasoline in the tank. And now we put, water in the tank and we are wondering why the car is not performing. Of course it will not. So this is a long way to answer your question. I really do believe that, diet will be fundamentally important. And if you ask yourself how we got here, what brought us to this disaster? And I think that there were 3 epochal changes in human history that brought us here. The first one was a good one, the advent of agricultures. So 10, 11,000 years ago, rather than to be gutter hunters, we domesticated crops and animals. And, we had prediction when the food was coming available or not. And that unleashed us time that we had to spend for food procurement to be creative, to build the Colosseum and that kind of stuff. The second movement was urbanization. And that was the beginning of the problem because, of course, when we moved from gutter hunters to, farmers, everybody was farming. The economy was based on exchanges. The hot commodity was not gold or oil, was olive oil and grains. Why? Because they were not perishable. So if you had that, you had a lot of wealth. But now with urbanization, there are people that are consumers but not producers. So farmers need to step up to produce for themselves or for the people in the city because they're consumers. But what's the kiss of death, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, has been the globalization. The production of the pipeline of food that we eat in the hand of few multinational companies that, of course, they look at the bottom line of the profits. So quality is not an issue for them. It's a matter of to make sure there's profit at all costs. So what is the solution? Back to the cave or back everybody goes to become farmers? Of course, this is an extreme, but eat stuff in season, mild zero, take the time to cook. That is a very relaxing and stress releasing, by the way. And that's not true that this takes a lot of time. That's absolutely not true. A good meal can be thrown together in 20 minutes if you have the shopping done on the weekend with all the stuff that you need available. So, and that will be, in my humble opinion, the best way to do it. Because anything else, probiotics, anything, it's an extra activity. You have to eat anyhow. You better eat well, and you take 2 birds with 1 stone.
No, I agree. And and I think cooking and preparing your own food, it gets your body ready for digestion, starts all the um, everything going so that you don't have some of this dysbiosis. People eating, we're not designed to eat through a window and keep driving and honking at people. And, we're not going to digest like that. In your book, you have a lot of great recipes, some really good crab cakes that I enjoyed. So I think that's great advice. So, folks, really, we're thinking about just how ancestrally we have lived, how these bodies, how these Ferraris are designed. That's what we have to give them back. And then the food these days, Dr. Fasano, the hyper processed food, the globalization of food has resulted in addictive foods that are specifically designed. People have been hooked up to functional MRIs to see if that particular taste combination and crunch and all is triggering dopamine. So I just feel like people are not knowing how it feels to be satisfied anymore with what they eat. So that leads me to get your opinion on these GLP-1 agonists, this new group of pharmaceuticals, Ozempic, Wegovy, everybody knows about those. Tell us how at this point in history. So this is October 24, and you're a learner, and we don't know everything. We know we don't know everything. What do you think those are doing to the gut microbiome?
So this would take an entire podcast to go through, but to make a long story short, just a little bit of physiology without going too much in the details because we don't have the time. But the control of hunger and society, it's a fascinating story that is worthwhile to review. And again, if you look at what are the mechanisms of control of this, are redundant, extremely complex, and they have one single goal, at least evolutionarily speaking, going back, this was built for a purpose to maintain metabolic homeostasis. And matter of fact, the most ancestral, stimulus to eat, what we call technically the homeostatic hunger, it comes from the hippocampus, the most ancestral part of our brain. And that is a very straightforward signal. If my stomach is gurgling, right, and is contracting, and if I have glucose level that go below a certain level, I have the stimulus to start to look for food. That is the time in which I definitely need to eat, because there are a lot of hormones that got in there and so on and so forth that will start the process. As soon as I got a hunter of 200,000 years ago, I got foods. So I got, fruits, vegetables, nuts, whatever it is, or a piece of meat, whatever it is. I start to eat, so I satisfy with that pulsion to get something in my mouth. Satiety signal will start, including GLP-1, that say, you know what, enough. You introduce in your mouth enough foods that, in a couple hours, you're going to be fine. You don't need any more. Evolutionarily speaking, later on, there was another stimulus of hunger that is called the hedonic hunger, that is coming from the frontal lobe. Mm-hmm. That is nothing to do with the pulsion and necessity to stay alive. So metabolically necessary to have energy to spend for my activity, but it's just stimulated even when I don't need to eat. Classical example, if we're stressed or bored and we're home and there is ice cream in the freezer and I don't have the stimulus to eat, sooner or later you will open that door and dig into this. And again, in other words, the hedonic hunger is the one that eventually is stimulated when there is no absolutely strict necessity to satisfy that metabolic needs to bring the glucose level back to normal. So in other words, we can have glucose level that are absolutely normal, and yet we eat. And of course, this is possible because we have at disposition food. So the limiting step is not procurement anymore. The limiting step is controlling. Am I capable to control the impulse to eat even if I don't need to? And most of us, we do not. Because we have this sweet tooth, because we're bored, because again, we are stimulated by vision, by advertisements and on the TV, whatever it is, okay? And what we do in this kind of stuff, rather to do what is typically logical to do, self-control, use educational approach and say, you know what, if I really have the stimulus, maybe a carrot rather than a cookie will do better to me. I want a shortcut. And what is my shortcut? What is the signal that stopped me eating? GLP-1. I've got GLP-1 receptor agonists, and that will do that. Now again, I don't want to demonize this, because there are people that they can try to control to the wazoo, and yet they have obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases. There, when you tried everything and there's nothing that you really control, I see the rational. But the model that needs to lose another 20 pounds because she or he is 130 and wants to go 110, the actor or the actress because they want to look young, and so on and so forth, or the shortcut to lose weight, okay? I don't think that that's the appropriate use of it. I definitely don't think that it's the appropriate way to use this. So, again, we are in the cultural wealth and therefore food abundance. And we don't see the big picture, how this is so insane. If I came from Mars, okay, I was from Mars and looking down the earth, I would see on the left people that will eat 60% more of the calories that they need. And to do that, they spend roughly $20 billion. And then they spend another $2 billion of advertisement to push me to eat more. And then I spend roughly another $1 billion to go to the gym to try to lose the weight that I'm putting extra there. All right? On the right, I see people that are dying of starvation. And I learned that to make these people survive would take 1/10 of the money that these people on the left are spending to make them to survive. Now, they both live a very miserable life. They are dying of starvation. These people will die of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, the whole 9 yards are associated to inappropriate, eating and so on and so forth. And I, as a Martian, say, are they nuts? Do they see each other? And by the way, 30% of produced, I would say food in general, is trashed every day in the Western Hemisphere. I
Yeah.
rest my case because I don't know
No,
what to say.
no,
And by the way, lots of piece of I live in Boston. Okay, it's a wealthy city, but still we have inner city kids that if they don't go to school, they don't have food to eat. They're exposed to junk food because school, that's what they provide. And now we have finally initiatives that they go to the different stores that say, you know what, you have 1 day shelf life of these fruits and vegetables, and tomorrow somebody needs to come to pick it up and you have to pay this individual. Give that to me. I bring this to school. I cook them, and so they can have a meal that is a decent meal today. That little it takes.
Well, and yes, Dr. Fasano, it has so much to do with relationships. It has so much to do with the ability to learn and get along at school and to like learning. These natural foods that feed our microbiome are the foods that naturally help us feel satiated, that that feed the good bacteria that produce the oxytocin or whatever neurochemicals that we need. And and it just comes down to real food. Um, so for our listeners, look for recipes in these books. It's really good because you think Italian food and you think, oh, bread and pasta and, um, you know, spaghetti, and it's not that way at all, is it? From where
Not at all.
in real
Not at all.
life.
No, no, not at all. I mean, again, I come from a very humble family, and the region where I'm coming from is, near Chilento, where the Mediterranean diet was quote unquote discovered. And, I didn't know that I was eating Mediterranean diet when I was young because I know better. The source of proteins for us were legumes, lentils, chickpeas, beans, that kind of stuff. Meat was such a hot and very expensive commodity that we had access maybe once a week if it was even that. But that's how we grew up. A lot of lentils, a lot of legumes, fruits and vegetables to the wazoo, and so on and so forth. This stuff is expensive now. That was called the diet of the poor. Now this is the diet of the wealthy because it's much cheaper to go to a fast food and buy a sandwich for $1 or $2, whatever that will be today, maybe even $5. With $5, you buy one green pepper, maybe, or a piece of lettuce. So that's it. That you're done. And if I'm a single mother with 2 kids to feed and I have a budget of $10 a day, where am I going to go? I have to buy fruit and vegetables, all this fast food, and fill the belly of my kids. So that's also involves a social, discrimination there. Because you can preach to the choir till tomorrow morning that we have to eat better, not empty calories, junk stuff, and so on and so forth. But in the practicality of the matter, if I don't have in a car to go shopping, just to go to a place, that will get the stuff would take, probably 3 or 4 blocks, during which I found 6 or 7 fast food, stuff in there. I'm not going to stop before.
Right. And then the children just get used to that kind of food. I mean, it's just such a horrible problem. It's heartbreaking
Yeah,
being from, here in Oklahoma where a lot of us have gardens, and um I know it's just beyond comprehension to think about children that never have fresh food. And that's the thing that's going to help them be successful in life. Because
that's
we
right.
eat 2 or 3 times a day. Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Fasano. I know you've got 14 places to be today. I can't thank you for your research. Hopefully, you'll keep researching. I think you and I probably went to medical school about the same time. So it's just so fun to see how much there is still to learn. I recognized your humility and curiosity years ago when I heard you lecture. So, um, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you, listeners. Thank you for tuning in to Vitality Made Simple. We just want to help you have more energy, more brain clarity, sleep better so that you can enjoy the relationships in your life. It's all about relationships. We're now in about 131 countries, and I guess approaching 5,000 cities. And that's because you're sharing, because I'm not that good at social media. So thank you again. Blessings until next time.